a kingdom of crime and crimson roses. Alessandra Romano had always been told that men like Dario Benedetti were untouchable, that they ruled, that they took what they wanted. But when her father made a mistake, she was delivered to his estate like a gift wrapped in silk. He ran a finger along her throat, his voice a quiet promise. "You belong to me now, Dulcezza," he murmured. "Let's see if you can behave." Chapter 1. The Unveiling of a Gilded Cage. The wrought iron gates, intricate as a spider's web and twice as menacing, swung inward with a groan that echoed the turmoil in Alessandra's stomach. Beyond them lay the Villa Benedetti, a sprawling estate perched on a cliff overlooking the turbulent Tyrrhenian Sea. It was beautiful, undeniably so, with its sun-drenched terraces, manicured gardens, and the scent of lemon blossoms hanging heavy in the air. But to Alessandra, it was nothing more than a gilded cage, exquisitely crafted to hold her captive. Her father's words, spoken just hours before, still rang in her ears, each syllable a hammer blow to her heart. "It's for the best, Alessandra. For the family. This is how we survive." Survive. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. He hadn't even met her eyes when he'd said it, his gaze fixed on the polished wood of his desk, avoiding the tremor in his own hands. He'd made a mistake, a costly one, involving a shipment, a debt, and the unforgiving wrath of Dario Benedetti. And she, his only daughter, was the price of his redemption. The black sedan that had carried her from her childhood home, from the life she knew, purred to a stop before the imposing entrance. A man, his face etched with the same hard lines as the villa itself, opened the door for her. He didn't speak, merely offered a curt nod, his eyes devoid of any warmth or pity. She stepped out, the silk of her dress, a pale blush color chosen by her mother with trembling hands, whispering against her skin. It felt wrong. This forced elegance, this pretense of normalcy in the face of such utter devastation. Alessandra smoothed a hand over the fabric, a futile attempt to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She was 38, not a naive girl. She'd lived a sheltered life, yes, protected within the walls of her family's influence, but she was not ignorant of the world's darker corners. She knew of the famigli, the intricate web of power and loyalty that governed their city, their lives. And she knew of Dario Benedetti, the capo of the most formidable family of them all. A man whispered about in hushed tones, a legend shrouded in both fear and a strange, magnetic allure. The massive wooden doors of the villa swung open, revealing a cavernous foyer. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting the marble floor in a kaleidoscope of colors. The air was thick with the scent of old money, of polished wood, and something else, something darker, something that prickled her skin with unease. A woman, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face a mask of polite indifference, approached. "Signorina Romano," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion. "I am Signora Lucia, the housekeeper. Signor Benedetti is expecting you. Please follow me." Alessandra followed, her footsteps echoing on the polished floors. Each step felt heavy, laden with the weight of her impending fate. They passed through opulent rooms, each more lavish than the last, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, a music room with a grand piano gleaming in the afternoon light, a formal dining room that could easily seat 50. It was a display of wealth, of power, meant to intimidate, to overwhelm. Finally, they reached a set of double doors, intricately carved with scenes of mythical creatures and fierce battles. Signora Lucia knocked once, a sharp rap that seemed to reverberate through Alessandra's very bones. A voice, deep and resonant, answered from within. "Enter." The housekeeper opened the doors, revealing a study that was both opulent and surprisingly intimate. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but unlike the library, these were filled with well-worn volumes, their spines faded with age. A large desk, crafted from dark wood, dominated the room, its surface cluttered with papers and a single, antique silver inkwell. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. And there, standing by the window, his back to the room, was Dario Benedetti. He turned as she entered, and Alessandra felt her breath catch in her throat. He was taller than she'd imagined, his presence filling the room. His dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples, adding a touch of distinguished maturity to his otherwise strikingly handsome features. His eyes, the color of deep sea after a storm, were intense, assessing, and held a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher: weariness, perhaps, or a carefully guarded vulnerability. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit, the fabric tailored to perfection, emphasizing the lean, powerful lines of his body. He didn't smile. He simply studied her, his gaze lingering on her face, her hair, the trembling curve of her lips. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine.
Alessandra Romano.
He said her name as if tasting it, weighing it, judging it. You are even more beautiful than the report suggested. The compliment, if it could be called that, felt more like an assessment, a cold calculation of her worth. Alessandra lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a defiance she didn't quite feel. I am not a commodity, Signor Benedetti. A flicker of amusement, or perhaps surprise, crossed his features. No, he agreed, his voice still low. You are a debt d'altezza, a debt paid in full. He moved toward her, his movements fluid and graceful, like a predator stalking its prey. He stopped just inches away, close enough for her to catch the scent of his cologne, a subtle blend of citrus and spice, with an underlying note of something darker, something untamed. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, the touch surprisingly gentle. Alessandra flinched, but she didn't pull away. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. My father, she began, her voice trembling slightly. Your father, he interrupted, his voice hardening, is no longer your concern. You are under my protection now, under my care. His eyes held hers, a silent promise, a silent threat. She was trapped. There was no escape. But even in the face of such overwhelming power, a spark of defiance flickered within her. She would not be broken. She would not be a docile plaything. She would find a way to survive, to navigate this treacherous new world, to retain some semblance of herself, even within the confines of this gilded cage. But what would happen when the owner of the cage decided to test the limits of her will? Chapter 2. Whispers of Benedetti's Shadow. The first few days at the Villa Benedetti were a blur of strained politeness and suffocating silence. Alessandra was given a suite of rooms overlooking the sea, spacious and beautifully appointed, yet they felt more like a prison cell than a sanctuary. Signora Lucia, ever present and ever watchful, attended to her needs with a detached efficiency that bordered on chilling. Meals were taken in a smaller, more intimate dining room, often alone, the silence punctuated only by the clinking of silverware against china. Dario was a phantom, a presence felt more than seen. He would occasionally appear at dinner, his conversation polite but distant, his eyes constantly assessing her, probing for weaknesses. He spoke of mundane things: the weather, the gardens, a new shipment of wine from Tuscany, but Alessandra sensed a deeper current beneath the surface, a carefully constructed facade, hiding a world of secrets and unspoken power. She spent her days exploring the villa and its grounds, seeking solace in the beauty of the gardens. She discovered a hidden grotto, a secluded spot where a natural spring fed a small pool, its surface shimmering with reflected sunlight. It became her refuge, a place where she could escape the watchful eyes of the household and allow herself to feel the weight of her situation. One afternoon, while wandering through the vast library, she stumbled upon a collection of old photographs. They were tucked away in a dusty album, hidden behind a row of leather-bound books. The photographs depicted a younger Dario, his features softer, his smile more readily given. He was surrounded by family, a beautiful woman with laughing eyes, presumably his wife, and two young children, a boy and a girl, their faces mirroring his own. Alessandra felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name: sadness, perhaps, or a sense of shared loss. She knew, From the whispers she'd overheard from the staff, that Dario's wife and children had died years ago, victims of a car accident, or so the official story went. But the family were notorious for their secrets, for their carefully constructed narratives that hid a darker truth. As she studied the photographs, she noticed a recurring symbol, a crest depicting a lion rampant, its claws extended, its roar seemingly echoing through the ages. It was the Benedetti family crest, a symbol of power, of dominance, of a legacy forged in blood and loyalty. She'd seen it before, subtly embossed on the silverware, carved into the headboard of her bed, a constant reminder of whose control she was under. That evening, Dario joined her for dinner. He seemed different, more approachable, the usual guardedness in his eyes softened by a hint of something else. Melancholy, perhaps. "You've been exploring the library," he said, his voice low, as he poured them both a glass of wine. It wasn't a question. Alessandra nodded. "I found some old photographs." He paused, his hand hovering over the wine bottle.
"Ah, yes. The past."
He said the word with a mixture of fondness and regret. "Your family," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "They were everything to me." The pain in his voice was palpable, a raw wound that time had failed to heal. "I'm sorry," she said, the words feeling inadequate in the face of such profound loss. He shook his head. It was a long time ago, but his eyes betrayed him, revealing the depth of his grief. He changed the subject, steering the conversation towards safer ground, but the brief glimpse into his vulnerability had shifted something between them. It was a crack in his armor, a fleeting moment of shared humanity in a world defined by power and control. Later that night, as Alessandra lay in bed, the sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs below a constant lullaby, she found herself thinking about Dario, about the photographs, about the sadness that lingered in his eyes. She was still his prisoner, his plaything, as her father so callously put, but she was beginning to see him as something more than just her captor. He was a man haunted by his past, a man burdened by the weight of his responsibilities, a man capable of both great cruelty and surprising tenderness. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, allowing herself to feel anything other than fear and resentment towards him. But she couldn't help but be drawn to the mystery that surrounded him, to the unspoken sadness that seemed to cling to him like a shadow. And as she drifted off to sleep, she dreamt of lions and storms, of hidden grottos and whispered secrets, and a pair of eyes, the color of the deep sea, that held both a promise and a threat. Would she be able to navigate this treacherous path, or would she become another casualty of the Benedetti legacy? Chapter 3. Debts paid in silk and fear. The silk dress felt like a second skin, molding to her curves, a shimmering emerald green that mirrored the turbulent sea outside. It was a gift, of course. Everything here was a gift, a carefully calculated gesture designed to remind her of her position, of her indebtedness. Signora Lucia had laid it out on the bed earlier that evening, along with a pair of delicate silver sandals and a matching clutch. "Signor Benedetti requests your presence at dinner," she'd said, her voice devoid of any inflection. "He has guests." Alessandra had felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. Guests. That meant other members of the family, other eyes scrutinizing her, judging her, assessing her worth as the capo's new acquisition. She had spent the past week trying to avoid attention, to blend into the background, to become as invisible as possible. But tonight, that was clearly not an option. She dressed slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the delicate clasp of the necklace that had also been provided a single strand of pearls, their cool smoothness a stark contrast to the heat of her skin. She studied her reflection in the mirror, her eyes searching for any sign of the fear that threatened to consume her. She saw a woman who looked both fragile and defiant, her chin lifted, her gaze steady, despite the tremor in her heart. She found Dario waiting for her in the drawing room, his back to the fireplace, a glass of amber liquid swirling in his hand. He turned as she entered, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her appearance. He didn't speak for a moment, his gaze lingering on her, a slow, deliberate assessment that made her skin prickle with a mixture of unease and something else, something she couldn't quite define. "You look," he began, his voice trailing off, as if searching for the right word. "Exquisite," he finally finished, the word a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. Alessandra managed a small, tight smile. "Thank you, Signor Benedetti." "Dario," he corrected, his eyes holding hers. "Please. We are beyond formalities. Are we not?" She hesitated, unsure how to navigate this sudden shift in his demeanor. "Dario," she repeated, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. He gestured towards the drinks cabinet. "Aperitivo?" She nodded, accepting a glass of Prosecco, the bubbles fizzing against her lips. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but charged with an unspoken tension. The guests arrived shortly after, two couples, their names a blur of unfamiliar Italian syllables. They were all impeccably dressed, their conversation flowing effortlessly, a mixture of Italian and English, punctuated by laughter and the clinking of glasses. Alessandra recognized one of the men, Don Carlo Rossi, a rival capo, his reputation for ruthlessness preceding him. He greeted her with a polite nod, his eyes cold and calculating, assessing her with the same detached scrutiny as a buyer examining a piece of livestock. The other couple, Don Antonio and Donna Isabella Moretti, were older, more refined, their demeanor suggesting a long-standing alliance with the Benedetti family. Donna Isabella, a woman of striking beauty, even in her later years, greeted Alessandra with a genuine warmth, her smile reaching her eyes. "You are even more lovely than Dario described," she said, her voice a gentle murmur. "Welcome to our world." The word world hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. It was a world of power and privilege, of secrets and betrayals, of ancient codes and unbreakable bonds. And Alessandra was now a part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. Dinner was a lavish affair, a seemingly endless parade of courses, each more exquisite than the last. The conversation flowed around her, a torrent of business dealings, political maneuverings, and veiled threats disguised as polite banter. Alessandra listened, observing, trying to decipher the intricate web of relationships and rivalries that define this world. She noticed the way Dario commanded the room, his presence effortlessly dominating the conversation. He was charming, witty, and utterly ruthless, his every word, every gesture, carefully calculated to achieve a desired effect. She saw the fear and respect in the eyes of the other men, the admiration and envy in the eyes of the women. He included her in the conversation, drawing her out, asking her opinion on various matters, as if she were an equal, a valued partner. It was a performance, of course, a carefully crafted illusion designed to impress his guests. But it was also something more. It was a test, a challenge, to see how she would navigate this treacherous terrain. As the evening wore on, Alessandra found herself drawn into the conversation, her initial apprehension slowly giving way to a cautious curiosity. She listened, she learned, she adapted. She realized that she was not just a pawn in this game, she was a player, whether she knew the rules or not. And she was determined to play to win. Later, as the guests were preparing to leave, Don Carlo Rossi approached her, his eyes lingering on her with a predatory gleam. "You are a valuable asset, Signorina Romano," he said, his voice a low purr. "Dario is a lucky man." Alessandra met his gaze, her expression carefully neutral. "I am not an asset, Don Carlo," she replied, her voice steady. "I am a woman." He chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "Of course. But in our world, women can be very valuable assets indeed." Dario appeared at her side, his hand lightly touching the small of her back, a gesture of possession that sent a shiver down her spine. "Don Carlo," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "I believe it is time for you to leave." The tension between the two men was palpable, a silent battle of wills. Don Carlo bowed his head slightly, a gesture of grudging respect. "Of course, Don Dario. My apologies." He turned and walked away, his departure leaving a palpable sense of relief in the room. Dario turned to Alessandra, his eyes searching hers. "Are you all right?" She nodded, managing a small smile.
I'm fine.
He didn't press her, but she saw the flicker of anger in his eyes, the barely contained fury at Don Carlo's veiled threat. It was a reminder that even in this world of opulent beauty and carefully constructed civility, danger lurked just beneath the surface. And she was now caught in the crossfire, a pawn in a deadly game of power, with her life hanging precariously in the balance. Could she trust the man who held her captive, the man who was both her protector and her greatest threat? Chapter 4. The First Supper, the First Crack. The formal dining room, with its long, gleaming mahogany table, felt miles away from the intimate setting where Alessandra had usually taken her meals. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight was a statement, a deliberate display of power and possession. The table was set for three, the crystal glasses sparkling under the light of the massive chandelier, the silver cutlery reflecting the flickering flames of the candles. Alessandra sat at one end, Dario at the head, and an empty chair, a stark reminder of her isolation, at the other. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the soft clinking of china as the servants, their movements silent and efficient, served the first course, a delicate antipasto of marinated artichoke hearts and thinly sliced prosciutto. Dario watched her, his expression unreadable. He had barely spoken since the incident with Don Carlo Rossi, the tension still radiating from him like heat from a furnace. Alessandra picked at her food, her appetite lost to the knot of anxiety in her stomach. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said, his voice breaking the silence. Alessandra looked up, surprised. "I did?" He nodded, a slight smile playing on his lips. "You did not cower. You did not flinch. You held your own." She felt a flicker of pride, a small victory in a world where she felt increasingly powerless. "I learned from the best," she said, a hint of irony in her voice. His smile widened, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his features from cold and calculating to surprisingly warm. "Indeed. But you have a natural grace, Alessandra. A strength that cannot be taught." She lowered her gaze, unsure how to respond. His compliments felt both sincere and manipulative, a carefully crafted blend of truth and deception. The servants cleared the plates, replacing them with the second course, a creamy risotto infused with saffron and parmesan. Alessandra took a tentative bite, the rich flavors momentarily distracting her from her unease. "Tell me about your life," Dario said, his voice soft, inviting. "Before this." She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She had been warned, by her father, by her mother, by everyone she knew, to be careful, to be guarded, to reveal nothing that could be used against her. But there was something in his eyes, a genuine curiosity, that made her want to trust him, to open up, to share a piece of herself. "It was ordinary," she said, her voice a whisper. "A comfortable life. Family, friends, studies. I worked as a curator at a small art museum. I loved it." "Art?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. She nodded. "I have always been drawn to beauty, to the stories that art can tell." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "And what story does your art tell, Alessandra?" She met his eyes, her gaze unwavering. "It tells of resilience, of hope, of the enduring power of the human spirit." He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them. He saw her, she realized. He saw beyond the facade, beyond the fear, to the woman she truly was. And in that moment, she felt a connection to him, a spark of understanding that transcended their vastly different worlds. The servants brought the main course, roasted lamb with rosemary and garlic, accompanied by roasted vegetables. The aroma filled the room, a comforting, familiar scent that momentarily eased the tension. As they ate, Dario began to talk about his own life, about his childhood, his early years in the famiglia, the weight of responsibility that had been thrust upon him at a young age. He spoke of his father, a stern, demanding man who had taught him the harsh realities of their world. He spoke of his wife, of his children, the pain of their loss still evident in his voice, even after all these years. Alessandra listened, captivated by his story, by the raw emotion that he allowed himself to reveal. She saw a different side of him, a vulnerability that he usually kept carefully hidden. She saw a man who had been shaped by tragedy, by duty, by the relentless demands of his position. As the evening drew to a close, Alessandra felt a shift in their dynamic. The initial fear, the apprehension, had not entirely disappeared, but it was now tempered by a growing understanding, a hesitant connection. She was still his prisoner, his possession, but she was also beginning to see him as a human being, flawed and complex, capable of both great cruelty and surprising kindness. He walked her to her room, his hand lightly touching her arm, a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. He stopped at her door, his eyes searching hers. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. "For listening." She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you for sharing." He lingered for a moment, his gaze intense, then he leaned down and pressed a light kiss to her forehead, a gesture that was both tender and unexpected. It was not a lover's kiss, but something else, something more profound, a seal of trust, a promise of something. "Sleep well, Alessandra," he said, his voice a whisper. And as she closed the door behind her, she realized that the crack in his armor had widened, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the mask. But was it a glimpse of the real Dario, or just another carefully constructed facade? And how would this new, fragile connection affect her own fate, her own carefully guarded heart? She was starting to wonder if escaping this gilded cage would break her, or if staying would be even worse. Chapter 5. Gardens of Stone and Secrets. The gardens of the Villa Benedetti were a labyrinth of sculpted hedges, fragrant blooms, and hidden pathways. They were a world unto themselves, a sanctuary from the suffocating formality of the villa, and Alessandra found herself drawn to them more and more each day. She would wander for hours, losing herself in the intricate beauty of the landscape, seeking solace in the quiet solitude. She discovered a hidden rose garden, a riot of color and scent, where ancient stone benches offered a place to rest and reflect. She found a small, secluded fountain, its water trickling into a moss-covered basin, creating a soothing melody that calmed her troubled thoughts. And she returned, again and again, to the grotto, her secret refuge, where the sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating a dappled pattern on the water's surface. It was in the grotto that she often found herself thinking about Dario, about the complexities of his character, about the growing connection that she felt towards him, despite her better judgment. She replayed their conversations in her mind, analyzing his words, his gestures, his silences, searching for clues to his true nature. One afternoon, as she sat by the pool, her fingers trailing in the cool water, she heard a rustling in the bushes behind her. She turned, expecting to see one of the gardeners, but instead, she saw Dario, his expression unreadable. "I thought I might find you here," he said, his voice soft, as he approached. Alessandra's heart beat faster, a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. "It's peaceful here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze sweeping over the grotto, taking in its beauty. "It is. A hidden sanctuary." He sat down beside her, not too close, but close enough for her to feel the warmth of his presence. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but charged with an unspoken energy. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine, the sound of the trickling water a soothing backdrop to their silent communion. "You spend a lot of time here," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "I find it calming," she replied, her gaze fixed on the water. "A place to think." "And what do you think about Alessandra?" he asked, his voice gentle, probing. She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I think about my life, my future, my place in this world." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "And what conclusions have you reached?" She met his gaze, her expression defiant. "I have reached the conclusion that I will not be defined by my circumstances, that I will not be a victim, that I will find a way to survive." A flicker of admiration crossed his features. "You are stronger than you know, Alessandra." I have to be, she replied, her voice firm. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her hand, the touch sending a shiver down her spine. She didn't pull away. There are things you don't understand, Alessandra, he said, his voice low, intense. Things about this world, about my family, about me. Tell me, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, as if struggling with an internal conflict. It's not that simple. There are secrets, dangerous secrets. I'm not afraid, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and warning.
You should be.
He stood up, his movements abrupt, as if he regretted revealing even this much. I have to go. Business. He turned to leave, but then he paused, looking back at her. Be careful, Alessandra. This world is not what it seems. And not everyone is who they appear to be. His words hung in the air, a cryptic warning that sent a chill down her spine. She watched him walk away, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the garden, leaving her alone with her thoughts and a growing sense of unease. She spent the rest of the afternoon wandering through the gardens, her mind racing, trying to decipher the meaning of his words. What secrets was he hiding? What dangers lurked beneath the surface of this opulent world? And who could she trust? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, she found herself standing at the edge of the cliff, overlooking the turbulent sea. The wind whipped through her hair, carrying the scent of salt and something else, something wild, something untamed. She thought of Dario, of his strength, his vulnerability, his secrets. She thought of her own growing feelings for him, feelings that she knew were dangerous, forbidden, perhaps even foolish. But she couldn't deny them. They were there, a subtle undercurrent, pulling her towards him, despite the risks. And as the darkness gathered, she made a decision. She would not be a passive observer in this game. She would not be a victim. She would learn the rules, uncover the secrets, and fight for her own survival, even if it meant confronting the darkness that lurked within the heart of the Benedetti family. But what if the darkness was also within the man she was starting to care for? Would she be strong enough to face it, or would she be consumed by it? Chapter 6. Echoes of a Life Left Behind. A package arrived for Alessandra. A plain, brown cardboard box, unmarked except for her name, scrawled in a familiar hand. Her heart leaped into her throat as she recognized her mother's handwriting. Signora Lucia delivered it with her usual impassive expression, her eyes betraying nothing. Alessandra retreated to her room, her hands trembling as she tore open the box. Inside, nestled amongst layers of tissue paper, were remnants of her former life, a worn copy of her favorite novel, a collection of art books, a framed photograph of her and her parents, taken on her last birthday, and a letter. She unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the familiar script, her mother's words a lifeline to a world that felt increasingly distant. Her mother wrote of everyday things, the health of her father, the gossip of the neighborhood, the small details of a life that continued without her. But beneath the surface of the mundane, Alessandra detected a current of worry, of fear, of unspoken pleas for her to be careful, to be safe. Her father had added a short postscript, his handwriting shaky and uneven. We miss you, Alessandra. We pray for you every day. Be strong. The letter brought tears to her eyes, a wave of homesickness washing over her. She clutched the photograph to her chest, her fingers tracing the outlines of her parents' faces, their smiles a bittersweet reminder of a life that was now beyond her reach. She spent the rest of the day lost in memories, rereading the letter, examining the photographs, touching the familiar objects, trying to hold onto the fragments of her past. She felt a profound sense of isolation, a yearning for the comfort of her family, for the simplicity of her former life. That evening, Dario found her in the library, sitting by the window, the letter clutched in her hand. He saw the traces of tears on her cheeks, the sadness in her eyes. What is it? He asked, his voice gentle, concern etched on his features. She hesitated, unsure whether to share this piece of herself with him. But there was something in his gaze, a a sincerity that she couldn't ignore. She held out the letter. He took it, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. He read it silently, his expression shifting from curiosity to a quiet understanding. "Your family," he said, his voice low. She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I miss them." He handed the letter back to her, his fingers brushing against hers. "I understand." He sat down beside her, the silence stretching between them, not uncomfortable, but filled with a shared sense of loss, of longing. "It's not easy," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "to be separated from those you love." She looked at him, surprised by his empathy. "You know what that's like." He nodded, his gaze distant, lost in memories of his own. "I do." He didn't elaborate, but she didn't need him to. She saw the pain in his eyes, the unspoken grief that he carried within him. It was a reminder that even those who seemed to have everything, who wielded immense power, were not immune to the pain of loss, to the yearning for connection. "They worry about you," he said, his voice breaking the silence. Alessandra nodded. "I know. I will do everything in my power to keep you safe," he said, his voice firm, his eyes meeting hers. "That is my promise to you." His words, spoken with such conviction, sent a shiver down her spine. It was a promise that she desperately wanted to believe, but she also knew that promises, in this world, were often broken, betrayed, used as weapons of manipulation. "Thank you," she said, her voice a whisper. He stood up, his movements graceful, as if he was reluctant to break the connection between them. "Get some rest," he said, his voice soft. "Tomorrow is another day." And as he left the room, Alessandra was left with a mixture of emotions: gratitude for his understanding, hope for his protection, and a lingering fear of the unknown, of the forces that threatened to tear them apart. She clutched the letter to her chest, a tangible link to her past, a reminder of who she was, of where she came from. It was a source of strength, a reminder that even in this gilded cage, she was not alone. But would that strength be enough to protect her from the shadows that surrounded her, from the secrets that Dario kept hidden, even from her? The echoes of her old life were a comfort, but they also served as a stark reminder of everything she had lost, and everything she stood to lose. Chapter 7. The Serpent's Charm, the Lion's Gaze. Donatello Bellini arrived at the Villa Benedetti with the subtlety of a viper slithering into a nest of doves. He was Dario's consigliere, his advisor, his right-hand man, and Alessandra had heard whispers of his reputation, a man known for his cunning, his ruthlessness, and his unwavering loyalty to Dario. He was younger than Alessandra expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and a smile that was both charming and unsettling. He was impeccably dressed, his suit tailored to perfection, his movements fluid and graceful, like a dancer or a predator. He greeted Alessandra with a polite bow, his eyes lingering on her with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something that made her skin crawl. "Signorina Romano," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you. Dario has spoken highly of you." Alessandra managed a polite smile, her instincts screaming at her to be wary of this man. "Signor Bellini," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. Dario, who had been standing by the window, watching their exchange, turned and approached. "Donatello, you remember Alessandra." It wasn't a question. "Of course," Bellini replied, his smile never wavering. "How could I forget?" The three of them sat down in the drawing room, the air thick with unspoken tension. Bellini dominated the conversation, his words carefully chosen, his gaze constantly shifting between Dario and Alessandra, as if assessing their dynamic, searching for weaknesses. He spoke of business matters, of upcoming negotiations with rival families, of the delicate balance of power that governed their world. Alessandra listened, observing, trying to decipher the hidden meanings behind his words, the subtle nuances of their interactions. She noticed the way Dario deferred to Bellini, seeking his counsel, trusting his judgment. It was clear that Bellini held a position of significant power within the Benedetti family, a power that went beyond his official title. As the conversation progressed, Bellini began to direct his attention towards Alessandra, asking her questions about her background, her interests, her opinions. His questions were seemingly innocent, but Alessandra sensed a deeper purpose behind them, a probing curiosity that made her uncomfortable. Dario tells me you are a woman of refined tastes, he said, his voice a low purr. That you appreciate art, beauty. I do, Alessandra replied, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart. And what do you think of our world, Signorina Romano? He asked, his eyes locking with hers. Do you find it beautiful? She hesitated, unsure how to answer. She knew that this was a test, a challenge, to see how she would respond. I find it complex, she finally said, her voice carefully measured. He chuckled, a soft, chilling sound. Complex, indeed. It is a world of shadows, Signorina Romano. Of secrets and betrayals. Of beauty and brutality. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. But it is also a world of opportunity. For those who are clever enough. For those who are willing to play the game. His words hung in the air, a veiled threat, a subtle invitation. Alessandra met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She would not be intimidated. She would not be seduced. She would not be drawn into his web of deceit. I am not interested in playing games, Signor Bellini, she said, her voice firm. His smile widened, a predatory gleam in his eyes. Perhaps not. But the game, Signorina Romano, is already being played. And you, whether you like it or not, are a player. Dario, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke, his voice dangerously soft. Donatello, that is enough. Bellini bowed his head slightly, a gesture of deference. Of course, Dario. My apologies. The tension in the room remained, thick and palpable, even after Bellini had shifted the conversation to other matters. Alessandra felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition of danger. She realized that Bellini was not just Dario's advisor, he was also a threat, a rival, a serpent lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Later that evening, as Alessandra was preparing for bed, she found Dario waiting for her in her sitting room. He looked troubled, his expression clouded with concern. Donatello can be unsettling, he said, his voice apologetic. He is dangerous, Alessandra replied, her voice firm. Dario nodded, his gaze meeting hers. He is. But he is also necessary. Necessary? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Why? He hesitated, as if reluctant to reveal too much. He is my balance. My conscience, in a way. He sees things that I do not. He understands the darker aspects of our world. And what is your role, Dario? She asked, her voice soft. The lion, I presume? He smiled, a wry, self-deprecating smile. Something like that. The lion and the serpent, she said, her voice thoughtful. A dangerous combination. Perhaps, he agreed. But also a powerful one. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, the touch sending a shiver down her spine. Be careful, Alessandra, he said, his voice low, intense. Trust no one. Not even me. His words, spoken with such sincerity, sent a chill down her spine. She was caught between two powerful forces, the lion and the serpent, each vying for her loyalty, her trust. And she knew that her survival depended on navigating this treacherous path, on discerning the truth from the lies, on choosing the right side, or perhaps forging her own. But how could she trust her instincts when her heart was starting to betray her, leading her down a path she knew was fraught with danger? The serpent's charm was alluring, but the lion's gaze held a promise she couldn't ignore, a promise that both terrified and captivated her. Chapter 8. A dance of defiance and desire. The invitation arrived on a silver platter, delivered by Signora Lucia with her usual air of detached formality. It was an invitation to a ballo, a grand ball hosted by the Marchesi and Marchesa di Luca, another prominent family within their intricate social circle. The card was embossed with the Di Luca family crest, a stylized griffin, its wings spread in a gesture of both power and elegance. Signor Benedetti requests your presence, Signora Lucia stated, her voice devoid of any inflection. "He will be expecting you." Alessandra felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She had attended social gatherings before, smaller, more intimate affairs, but this was different. This was a public display, a formal presentation of her to the wider family network, a clear statement of her position within the Benedetti household. She knew that she would be scrutinized, judged, assessed by everyone in attendance. She would be the subject of whispers, of speculation, of envy, and perhaps even hostility. She would be the capo's companion, his possession, his plaything, as some would undoubtedly see her. She spent the days leading up to the ball in a state of quiet anxiety, her mind racing with possibilities, with scenarios both real and imagined. She practiced her Italian, reviewed the intricate etiquette of their world, tried to anticipate the challenges she would face. Dario, sensing her unease, offered words of reassurance, of guidance, of subtle warnings. "Be yourself, Alessandra," he said, his voice gentle. "But be careful. This is a world of appearances, of hidden agendas. Trust your instincts." He had a gown made for her, a masterpiece of design, crafted from shimmering silk, the color of a midnight sky, studded with tiny crystals that sparkled like distant stars. It was a dress designed to make a statement, to command attention, to project an image of both power and vulnerability. On the night of the ball, Alessandra dressed slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the delicate clasp of a diamond necklace, another gift from Dario, its cold fire a stark contrast to the heat of her skin. She studied her reflection in the mirror, her eyes searching for any sign of the fear that threatened to consume her. She saw a woman transformed, a woman who looked both regal and fragile, her beauty enhanced by the exquisite gown, her vulnerability masked by a carefully constructed facade. Dario was waiting for her at the foot of the grand staircase, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her appearance. He didn't speak for a moment, his gaze lingering on her, a slow, deliberate assessment that made her skin prickle with a mixture of anticipation and unease. "You are breathtaking," he finally said, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. Alessandra managed a small, tight smile. "Thank you, Dario." He offered her his arm, his touch surprisingly gentle, and they walked together towards the waiting limousine, the silence between them charged with an unspoken energy. The ballroom was a spectacle of opulence, a dazzling display of wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a shimmering light on the elaborately dressed guests, the air thick with the scent of perfume and expensive champagne. The orchestra played a lively waltz, the music filling the room, a swirling backdrop to the intricate dance of social maneuvering. As Dario and Alessandra entered, a hush fell over the room, all eyes turning towards them. Alessandra felt a wave of heat rise to her cheeks, her heart pounding in her chest. She held her head high, her gaze steady, determined to project an image of confidence, of composure, despite the tremor in her heart. Dario guided her through the crowd, introducing her to various members of the family, their names a blur of unfamiliar faces and titles. She was greeted with a mixture of polite curiosity, veiled envy, and outright hostility. She sensed the whispers, the speculation, the judgments being made. She danced with Dario, his hand firm on the small of her back, guiding her through the intricate steps of the waltz. He was a surprisingly graceful dancer, his movements fluid and confident, his eyes never leaving hers. She felt a strange sense of security in his arms, a sense of protection from the prying eyes of the crowd. But she also danced with other men who were eager to get closer to the capo's new companion, men who saw her as a prize, a trophy, a symbol of Dario's power. She navigated their advances with a careful blend of politeness and distance, aware that every word, every gesture, every glance was being observed, analyzed, interpreted. She saw Donatello Bellini watching her from across the room, his smile enigmatic, his eyes filled with a knowing gleam. She felt a shiver of unease, a premonition of danger. As the evening wore on, Alessandra found herself drawn into a conversation with the Marchesa di Lucca, a woman of sharp intelligence and subtle power. The Marchesa, unlike many of the other women, treated Alessandra with genuine respect, engaging her in a conversation about art, about literature, about the challenges of navigating their complex world. "You are a woman of substance, Signorina Romano," the Marchesa said, her voice a gentle murmur. "Dario is fortunate to have you." Alessandra felt a flicker of hope, a sense that she was not entirely alone in this world. But she also knew that alliances in this world were fleeting, that trust was a rare and precious commodity. Later, as Dario and Alessandra were preparing to leave, a man approached them, his expression urgent, his voice hushed. He spoke to Dario in rapid Italian, his words too fast for Alessandra to follow. Dario's expression hardened, his eyes turning cold. "What is it?" Alessandra asked, her voice filled with apprehension. Dario hesitated. Then he turned to her, his gaze intense. "There has been an incident. I have to go." He didn't elaborate, but she saw the unspoken urgency in his eyes, the barely contained tension in his body. She knew that this was not a social matter. This was something dangerous. "Will you be all right?" He looked away, and she knew. Something was terribly wrong. The dance had ended, abruptly, and she was suddenly alone, once again, on a stage filled with shadows. Would she find her footing, or was this the beginning of a fall she couldn't prevent? Chapter 9. Scars Beneath the Surface. The ride back to the Villa Benedetti was shrouded in a silence heavier than any Alessandra had yet experienced. Dario sat beside her, but he was miles away, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the rain-streaked windows. The incident, whatever it was, had clearly shaken him, stripping away the veneer of control he usually maintained so effortlessly. Alessandra didn't press him. She knew better. She had learned, in her short time in this world, that questions were often met with silence, with evasion, with outright lies. She had learned to read the unspoken, to interpret the silences, to sense the danger that lurked beneath the surface. Back at the villa, Dario disappeared into his study, the door closing behind him with a decisive click that echoed through the stillness of the house. Alessandra retreated to her own rooms, the silence of the vast space amplifying her unease. She changed out of the magnificent gown, the silk feeling cold and alien against her skin. She wrapped herself in a robe, the soft fabric a small comfort in the face of the growing storm within her. She paced restlessly, her mind racing, trying to piece together the fragments of information she had gleaned, trying to anticipate the consequences of whatever had transpired. She thought of the Marchesa di Luca's words, of Donatello Bellini's unsettling smile, of the veiled threats and subtle power plays that define this world. Hours passed. The villa remained eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling, the distant sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs. Alessandra found herself drawn to the window, her gaze fixed on the turbulent sea, the storm-tossed waves mirroring the turmoil within her. She didn't know how long she stood there, lost in thought, before she heard a soft knock on the door. She turned, her heart beating faster, expecting to see Signora Lucia, or perhaps one of the other servants. But it was Dario. He stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and something that looked like pain. He had changed out of his formal attire, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his hair disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it repeatedly. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice hesitant, almost vulnerable. Alessandra nodded, her throat tight with emotion. He entered the room, closing the door behind him. He didn't speak for a moment, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her appearance, her unease. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, his eyes meeting hers, "for ruining the evening." "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What happened?" He hesitated, as if struggling with an internal conflict. Then, he walked towards the fireplace, his movements stiff, his shoulders slumped. He stood there for a moment, his back to her, staring into the cold, empty hearth. "It was a rival family," he finally said, his voice strained. "A move against us. A challenge. Are you in danger?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. We are always in danger, Alessandra. That is the nature of our world. He walked towards her, his movements slow, deliberate. He stopped just inches away, close enough for her to feel the warmth of his presence, to see the raw emotion in his eyes. There was bloodshed, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Men died. Alessandra felt a chill run down her spine. She had known, intellectually, that violence was a part of this world, but to hear him speak of it so directly, so personally, brought the reality crashing down upon her. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, the touch surprisingly gentle. She flinched, but she didn't pull away. I did what I had to do, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of regret and determination. To protect my family, my interests. And me? She asked, her voice barely audible. His eyes held hers, a silent promise, a silent threat. You are under my protection, Alessandra. I will not let anyone harm you. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her skin. She could smell the faint scent of his cologne, mingled with something else, something darker, something metallic. The scent of blood. She closed her eyes, her senses overwhelmed by the proximity of him, by the raw emotion that emanated from him. She felt a strange mixture of fear and desire, of revulsion and attraction. She was drawn to him, despite the danger, despite the violence, despite everything she knew she should feel. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against her forehead, a light, tender kiss that sent a shiver down her spine. It was not a passionate kiss, but something more profound, a gesture of comfort, of reassurance, of connection. He pulled away, his eyes searching hers. Get some rest, he said, his voice soft. We will talk in the morning. And as he left the room, Alessandra was left with a whirlwind of emotions, a sense of confusion, of fear, of a growing intimacy that both terrified and exhilarated her. She saw the scars beneath his surface, the wounds that he carried within him, the burden of his responsibilities. And she realized that she was no longer just an observer in this world. She was a participant, entangled in his life, in his struggles, in his heart. She touched her forehead where his lips had been, and found it not cold, but burning. Where would this lead? She knew the answer, but could not yet admit it, even to herself. The scars he bore were not just his own, they were becoming hers, too. Chapter 10. The Unspoken Language of Touch. The days following the incident were marked by a palpable shift in the atmosphere of the Villa Benedetti. There was a heightened sense of vigilance, a subtle increase in security, a constant undercurrent of tension that permeated even the most mundane activities. Dario was more distant, more preoccupied, his mind clearly elsewhere, grappling with the aftermath of the violence and the ongoing threat to his power. Alessandra, however, found herself increasingly drawn to him, her concern for his well-being outweighing her fear of his world. She observed him closely, noticing the subtle signs of his stress, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he clenched his jaw when he thought no one was watching, the restless energy that seemed to emanate from him even when he was sitting still. She tried to offer him small comforts, gestures of support that required no words, no explanations. She would bring him a cup of strong coffee when he was working late in his study, her hand lingering on his shoulder for a moment longer than necessary. She would arrange fresh flowers in his room, choosing blooms in his favorite colors, a subtle reminder of beauty amidst the darkness. She would sit with him in silence, her presence a quiet offering of companionship, of understanding. Dario, in turn, began to seek her out, his need for her presence unspoken but evident. He would find her in the gardens, joining her on her walks, his silence a comfortable companion to her own. He would sit beside her in the library, reading his own book while she read hers, the shared silence a bond between them. He would touch her, small gestures of affection that spoke volumes, a hand on her arm, a brush of his fingers against her cheek, a light squeeze of her hand. It was in these small moments, in these unspoken exchanges, that their relationship deepened, evolving beyond the initial dynamic of captor and captive, of capo and possession. They were developing a language of touch, a silent communication that transcended the barriers of their vastly different worlds, of the secrets and dangers that surrounded them. One afternoon, Alessandra found Dario in the grotto, sitting by the pool, his gaze fixed on the shimmering water. He looked lost in thought, his expression troubled, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. She sat down beside him, not speaking, simply offering her presence. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers, a flicker of gratitude in their depths. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, his gaze lingering on her face. "For what?" she asked, her voice soft. "For being here," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "For understanding." She reached out, her hand covering his, her fingers intertwining with his. His hand was warm, strong, calloused from years of wielding power, of commanding respect, of violence. But beneath the surface, she felt a vulnerability, a need for human connection that he rarely allowed himself to show. He didn't pull away. He held her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, gratitude, longing, and something else, something that looked like desire. The silence stretched between them, charged with an unspoken energy. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine, the sound of the trickling water a soothing backdrop to their silent communion. He turned his hand, his fingers tightening around hers, his grip both firm and gentle. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a light kiss to her knuckles, the gesture sending a shiver down her spine. "Alessandra," he said, his voice a low murmur, his breath warm against her skin.
She didn't speak.
She couldn't. Her throat was tight with emotion, her heart pounding in her chest. She was caught in a whirlwind of conflicting feelings, fear, desire, confusion, and a growing sense of inevitability. He leaned closer, his eyes searching hers, seeking permission, seeking something. She didn't resist. She didn't pull away. She met his gaze, her eyes reflecting her own turmoil, her own longing, her own surrender. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, hesitant kiss that was both tender and electrifying. It was not a passionate kiss, not yet, but something more profound, a meeting of souls, a crossing of boundaries, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them, despite the odds, despite the dangers, despite everything. The kiss deepened, slowly, tentatively, as if both of them were afraid of breaking the spell, of shattering the fragile connection that had formed between them. It was a kiss filled with unspoken emotions, with years of loneliness, of grief, of longing, of a desperate need for human connection. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked, the silence between them now charged with a different kind of energy, an energy that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The unspoken language of touch had finally found its voice, and there was no turning back. But the unspoken question remained. Could this fragile connection survive the harsh realities of their world, or would it be consumed by the shadows that surrounded them, by the secrets that Dario still kept hidden? The language of touch had spoken, but would its message be one of love, or of ultimate destruction? Chapter 11. Cracks in the Foundation. The fragile peace that had settled over the Villa Benedetti, nurtured by the unspoken connection between Alessandra and Dario, began to show signs of strain. The outside world, with its relentless demands and ever-present dangers, intruded upon their carefully constructed sanctuary. Dario became increasingly withdrawn, his mood fluctuating between periods of intense focus and moments of dark brooding. He spent long hours in his study, poring over documents, speaking in hushed tones on the phone, his face a mask of concentration and concern. He was more guarded, more secretive, his eyes holding a haunted look that Alessandra couldn't decipher. She sensed a growing distance between them, a subtle withdrawal that chilled her to the bone. The easy intimacy they had shared, the unspoken language of touch, seemed to fade, replaced by a strained politeness, a forced formality that felt like a betrayal of the bond they had forged. She tried to reach him, to bridge the gap that was widening between them, but her efforts were met with resistance, with evasion, with a polite but firm dismissal. He would smile. He would reassure her. He would tell her that everything was fine, but his eyes betrayed him, revealing a turmoil that he refused to share. One evening, after a particularly strange dinner, Alessandra confronted him, her frustration and fear finally breaking through her carefully constructed composure. "What is happening, Dario?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What is wrong?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Nothing is wrong, Alessandra. I am busy. That is all." "Don't lie to me," she said, her voice rising. "I see it in your eyes. I feel it in your touch. Something has changed." He turned away from her, his shoulders slumping, as if he was carrying a heavy burden. "It's complicated," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Then uncomplicate it," she pleaded. "Talk to me. Let me help you." He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and frustration. "You cannot help me, Alessandra. You do not understand this world." "Then teach me," she said, her voice firm. "I am not afraid." He shook his head, his expression hardening. "It is not your concern. You are safe here. That is all that matters." "Safe?" she exclaimed, her voice laced with bitterness. "Is that all I am to you? A possession to be protected? A plaything to be kept safe?" His eyes flashed with anger, his jaw clenching.
Do not speak to me like that.
"Then treat me like more than that," she retorted. "Treat me like a partner, like someone you trust." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, his eyes burning into hers. "Trust is a luxury we cannot afford, Alessandra. Not in this world." "Then what are we doing, Dario?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What is this charade? This pretense of connection?" He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, the touch hesitant, almost apologetic. "It is not a charade, Alessandra." He stopped, his voice trailing off, as if he couldn't find the words, or perhaps as if he was afraid to speak them. The unspoken emotions hung heavy in the air, a mixture of desire, of regret, of a longing that could never be fully realized. He pulled away, his movements abrupt, as if he regretted revealing even this much. "I have to go," he said, his voice cold, distant. "Business." And as he left the room, Alessandra felt a crack forming in the foundation of their relationship, a fissure that threatened to widen into an unbridgeable chasm. She was left with a sense of despair, of frustration, of a growing realization that the man she was falling in love with was a stranger to her, a man trapped in a world of secrets and violence, a man who might never be able to truly open his heart to her. She went to the window, staring at the darkening sea, the waves crashing violently, as if in empathy with her turmoil. The cracks were not just in their relationship. She realized they were in the very structure of his world, a world built on lies, on betrayals, on a constant struggle for power. And she was caught in the middle, her fate intertwined with his, her heart at risk of being shattered by the forces that threatened to tear them apart. Could their love survive this world? Or was it doomed from the start, destined only to leave further, deeper scars? Chapter 12. The Weight of Family, the Price of Freedom. A summons arrived, not in the form of an elegant invitation, but as a terse, handwritten note, delivered by Donatello Bellini himself. His smile was, as always, unsettling, his eyes holding a glint of something that Alessandra couldn't quite decipher: amusement, perhaps, or a subtle warning. "Dario requests your presence," Bellini said, his voice smooth as silk. "A family matter." Alessandra felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. "Family matter?" she repeated, her voice carefully neutral. Bellini nodded, his smile never wavering. "Indeed. A gathering. At his ancestral home." Dario's ancestral home. Alessandra had heard whispers of it, a sprawling estate in the countryside, a place steeped in history, in tradition, in the dark legacy of the Benedetti family. It was a place rarely spoken of, a place shrouded in secrecy, a place where the weight of generations pressed down upon those who entered its gates. She found Dario in his study, his face pale, his expression grim. He looked up as she entered, his eyes searching hers, a flicker of something in their depths. Apology, perhaps, or a plea for understanding. You received the summons, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Alessandra nodded. What is it about? He hesitated, then he sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. My sister, Isabella, is returning home. His sister. Alessandra had known, intellectually, that Dario had a sister, but she had never been mentioned, never spoken of, as if she were a ghost, a forgotten figure in the Benedetti family history.
And?
Alessandra prompted, her voice soft. And she disapproves, Dario said, his voice barely a whisper.
Of us.
Alessandra felt a chill run down her spine. She had faced the scrutiny of rival families, the veiled threats of ambitious men, the subtle power plays of their world. But this was different. This was family. This was the weight of tradition, of expectation, of a legacy that stretched back generations.
Why?
She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Dario looked away, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window. She believes I have dishonored the family. By associating with an outsider. By breaking the rules. The rules, Alessandra repeated, her voice laced with bitterness. The unwritten laws that govern your lives. The laws that imprison you. He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resignation. They are not just rules, Alessandra. They are our way of life. Our way of survival. And what about my survival, Dario? She asked, her voice rising. What about my freedom? He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, but he didn't touch her. The distance between them felt vast, unbridgeable. I will protect you, Alessandra, he said, his voice firm. That is my promise. But at what cost? She asked, her voice breaking. At the cost of your happiness? At the cost of our love? He didn't answer. He couldn't. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air, a suffocating weight that threatened to crush them both. The journey to the ancestral home was long and silent. Alessandra sat beside Dario in the back of the limousine, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape, her mind racing with possibilities, with fears, with a growing sense of dread. The estate was even more imposing than she had imagined, a fortress of stone and secrets, surrounded by ancient walls, its gates guarded by men who looked more like soldiers than servants. The air was thick with the scent of history, of tradition, of a darkness that seemed to seep from the very stones themselves. They were greeted by a stern-faced woman, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes cold and assessing. This, Alessandra knew, was Isabella Benedetti, the matriarch of the family, the keeper of the flame, the guardian of their legacy. Isabella greeted Dario with a curt nod, her gaze lingering on Alessandra with a mixture of disapproval and disdain. So, she said, her voice sharp, her Italian accented with the weight of generations. This is the outsider. Alessandra felt her blood run cold. She had been prepared for scrutiny, for judgment, but she had not been prepared for this outright hostility, this blatant rejection. The weight of the family, the price of freedom, had never been so clear. And she was the price. Or was she? A new, chilling thought occurred to her. Perhaps Dario was the one paying the price, and she was merely the excuse. Which was worse? She wasn't sure. Chapter 13. Revelations in the Rain. The atmosphere inside the ancestral home was stifling, heavy with unspoken tensions and generations of accumulated secrets. Alessandra felt like an intruder, an unwelcome guest in a world where she did not belong, a world governed by rules she did not understand, a world that seemed determined to reject her. Isabella Benedetti, Dario's sister, was a formidable presence, her every word, every gesture, every glance radiating disapproval and disdain. She treated Alessandra with a cold formality, a deliberate distance that made it clear she considered her beneath contempt. She spoke to Dario in rapid Italian, her words sharp and accusatory, her tone brooking no argument. Alessandra, unable to fully understand their conversation, felt increasingly isolated, her sense of unease growing with each passing moment. She observed the interactions between Dario and his sister, the strained dynamic, the unspoken conflict, the weight of family expectations that pressed down upon them both. Dario, for his part, seemed to shrink under his sister's scrutiny, his usual confidence and authority replaced by a hesitant deference, a visible struggle to reconcile his loyalty to his family with his feelings for Alessandra. He tried to defend her, to explain, to justify his choices, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears, his pleas dismissed with a wave of Isabella's hand. Dinner was a torturous affair, a formal, silent meal punctuated by Isabella's pointed remarks and veiled criticisms. Alessandra picked at her food, her appetite lost to the knot of anxiety in her stomach. She felt the weight of Isabella's gaze upon her, a constant reminder of her outsider status, of her perceived unworthiness. After dinner, Isabella summoned Dario to a private meeting, leaving Alessandra alone in the vast, echoing drawing room. She wandered restlessly, her gaze drawn to the portraits that lined the walls, the faces of generations of Benedettis staring down at her, their expressions stern and unforgiving. She felt the weight of their legacy, the pressure of their expectations, the suffocating constraints of their world. A storm broke outside, the wind howling, the rain lashing against the windows, mirroring the turmoil within her. She felt a desperate need to escape, to breathe, to break free from the oppressive atmosphere of the house. She slipped out of the drawing room, unnoticed, and made her way to the gardens, the rain soaking her clothes, her hair, her skin. She didn't care. She welcomed the cold, the wet, the cleansing power of the storm. She found a small, secluded gazebo, its roof offering some protection from the downpour. She sat there, huddled in the darkness, her tears mingling with the rain, her sobs lost in the roar of the wind. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in her despair, before she heard a voice, a familiar voice, calling her name. Alessandra. She looked up, her vision blurred by tears and rain, and saw Dario, his face pale, his expression filled with concern. He was soaked to the bone, his hair plastered to his forehead, his clothes clinging to his body. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice urgent, as he reached the gazebo. "You'll catch your death." I couldn't breathe," she said, her voice trembling. "I had to get away." He sat down beside her, his arm going around her, drawing her close, offering her warmth, offering her comfort. She leaned into him, her body shaking with sobs, her emotions finally breaking free. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, his breath warm against her ear. "I'm so sorry." "It's not your fault," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "It's this world, this family, this pressure." He held her tighter, his hand stroking her hair, his silence a silent acknowledgement of the truth of her words. She hates me," Alessandra said, her voice breaking. "She doesn't understand," Dario replied, his voice firm. "She doesn't know you. She doesn't want to know me," Alessandra countered. "I'm a threat."
To her.
"To your family. To everything you've ever known." He pulled away slightly, his eyes searching hers, his gaze intense. "You are not a threat, Alessandra. You are a light. In a very dark world." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away the tears that streamed down her cheeks. "I will not let her hurt you," he said, his voice a vow. "I will not let anyone hurt you." "But at what cost, Dario?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "At what cost to you?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. The unspoken truth hung heavy between them, a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. He lowered his head, his lips finding hers, a desperate, passionate kiss that was both a plea and a promise. It was a kiss filled with longing, with regret, with a love that was both forbidden and undeniable. The rain continued to fall, washing away the past, washing away the secrets, washing away the pretense. And in that moment, in that secluded gazebo, amidst the storm, they found a moment of truth, a moment of clarity, a moment of surrender. He pulled back slightly, staring into her eyes. "She wants me to marry. Someone of her choosing. Someone of the family's." He watched her for a reaction. Alessandra felt all the breath rush out of her. It was as she feared. She was the complication, not the prize. "And will you?" He looked like he wanted to say 1,000 things. But instead, he just kept staring, the rain washing over his face as the revelations continued, not spoken, but clear as the storm around them. Chapter 14. A glimmer of trust, a shadow of betrayal. The revelation hung between them, heavy and suffocating, as tangible as the rain that continued to lash against the gazebo. Alessandra felt a cold dread seep into her bones, a chilling premonition of loss, of heartbreak, of a future that was slipping away from her grasp. Dario didn't answer her question. He didn't need to. His silence, his haunted eyes, his inability to meet her gaze spoke volumes. She knew. He would obey his sister. He would fulfill his duty to his family. He would sacrifice his own happiness, their love, on the altar of tradition, of expectation, of an unbreakable code. She pulled away from him, her body trembling, her heart shattering into a million pieces. She stood up, her legs shaky, her gaze fixed on the storm-tossed landscape, the wind whipping her hair around her face, her tears mingling with the rain. "Don't," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her voice choked with emotion.
Don't say anything.
Don't apologize. Don't explain. He stood up, reaching for her, his hand hovering over her arm, but he didn't touch her. "Alessandra, just leave me alone," she said, her voice breaking. "Please." He hesitated, his expression filled with pain, with regret, with a helplessness that mirrored her own. Then, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the darkness, swallowed by the storm. Alessandra remained in the gazebo, her body numb, her mind reeling, her heart aching with a pain she had never known before. She felt betrayed, abandoned, discarded, like a pawn in a game she had never understood, a game she had lost before she even knew she was playing. She didn't know how long she stayed there, lost in her grief, before she heard footsteps approaching, the sound muffled by the rain. She didn't turn. She didn't care. She had nothing left to lose. But it wasn't Dario. It was Donatello Bellini, his smile unsettling, his eyes glinting with something that looked like triumph. "Signorina Romano," he said, his voice smooth as silk, his tone mocking. "You look distraught." Alessandra didn't answer. She didn't have the strength, the will to engage with him, to play his games, to pretend. He stepped closer, his presence intrusive, his scent of expensive cologne a stark contrast to the clean, fresh smell of the rain. "Dario is a fool," he said, his voice low, conspiratorial. "He lets his emotions cloud his judgment." Alessandra finally turned to him, her gaze cold, her expression filled with disdain. "And you, Donatello? What do you let cloud your judgment?" He chuckled, a soft, chilling sound. "Power, Signorina Romano. Ambition. The pursuit of what is rightfully mine." He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, the touch sending a shiver of revulsion down her spine. She recoiled, her hand instinctively going to her face, wiping away the trace of his touch. "You are beautiful," he said, his voice a low purr. "And wasted. On a man who does not appreciate you.
On a man who is weak."
"Dario is not weak," Alessandra said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her heart. "He is trapped. By his family. By his duty." "Duty?" Bellini scoffed. "A convenient excuse. For a man who lacks the courage to seize what he desires." He stepped closer, his body almost touching hers, his gaze intense, predatory. "I, on the other hand," he said, his voice a whisper, "am not afraid. Of anything. Or anyone." He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear, his breath warm and unsettling. "I could offer you everything," he said, his voice a seductive promise.
Power. Wealth.
Freedom. From Dario.
From his family.
From this cage. Alessandra felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She pushed him away, her hands trembling, her eyes blazing with anger. "You are disgusting," she said, her voice filled with disgust. "I would rather die than be with you." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the gazebo. "Such passion," he said, his voice mocking. "Such defiance. Perhaps Dario was right about you. You are more than just a pretty face. He stepped back, his smile returning, his eyes holding a glint of something. A warning, perhaps, or a threat. But be careful, Signorina Romano, he said, his voice soft, dangerous. The game is not over. And I always win. He turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the darkness, leaving Alessandra alone with her fear, her anger, and a growing sense of dread. She realized, with a chilling certainty, that Bellini was not just Dario's advisor, he was his enemy, a rival, a serpent lurking in the shadows, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. And she was caught in the middle, a pawn in their deadly game, her life, her happiness, hanging in the balance. She looked out at the storm, the rain still falling, the wind still howling, the darkness all-encompassing. But amidst the darkness, she saw a glimmer of hope, a flicker of defiance, a spark of determination. She would not be defeated. She would not be a victim. She would fight. For her freedom. For her love. Even if it was a love that was doomed. Even if it was a love that could cost her everything. A glimmer of trust remained, but the shadow of betrayal loomed large, threatening to consume everything she held dear. But which would win? She couldn't know. But she knew she would not surrender. Chapter 15. The Lion's Roar. The Serpent Strike. Alessandra returned to the villa, drenched and shivering, her heart heavy with a mixture of grief, anger, and a growing sense of foreboding. She avoided the main areas of the house, seeking the solitude of her room, her sanctuary, the only place where she felt even remotely safe. She changed out of her wet clothes, wrapping herself in a warm robe, her body still trembling from the cold, from the emotional turmoil, from the encounter with Bellini. She felt a desperate need to talk to Dario, to confront him, to demand answers, to understand his choices, but she also knew that it was futile, that he was trapped, that he had made his decision, that their love was doomed. She paced restlessly, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the events of the evening, trying to anticipate what would happen next, trying to find a way out, a way to escape the suffocating constraints of this world, of this family, of this nightmare. She heard a knock on the door, her heart leaping into her throat. She hesitated, unsure whether to answer, unsure whether she could face him, unsure whether she could bear to hear the words that would confirm her worst fears. But it wasn't Dario. It was Signora Lucia, her face etched with concern, her eyes holding a flicker of something. Sympathy, perhaps, or a warning. Signorina Romano, she said, her voice low, urgent. You must leave.
Now.
Alessandra stared at her, her mind struggling to comprehend her words.
Leave?
What were you talking about? There is danger, Signora Lucia said, her voice barely a whisper. For you. Here. Tonight.
Danger?
From whom? Alessandra asked, her voice trembling. Signora Lucia hesitated, then she glanced around, as if to make sure they were not overheard. Signor Bellini, she said, her voice barely audible. He plans to. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Alessandra understood. Bellini was going to make his move. He was going to eliminate her, remove the obstacle, clear the path for his own ambitions. How do you know? Alessandra asked, her voice shaking. Signora Lucia looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. I have served this family for many years, she said, her voice low.
I have seen things.
Heard things. I know things. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, silver key. This is for the back gate, she said, pressing the key into Alessandra's hand. It leads to the road.
Go. Now.
Before it is too late. Alessandra took the key, her hand trembling, her mind racing. She didn't know why Signora Lucia was helping her. She didn't know if she could trust her, but she knew that she had no other choice. She had to escape. Thank you, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Thank you. Signora Lucia nodded, her expression grim.
Go. And be careful.
Alessandra didn't hesitate. She grabbed a coat, a scarf, anything to protect her from the elements, and slipped out of her room, making her way through the darkened corridors of the villa, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She reached the back gate, her hands shaking as she inserted the key into the lock. The gate creaked open, revealing the dark, rain-swept road beyond. She stepped out, closing the gate behind her, her gaze sweeping the surroundings, looking for any sign of danger, any sign of pursuit. She started running, her lungs burning, her legs aching, her mind racing. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know what she would do. She only knew that she had to get away, as far away as possible, from the villa, from Bellini, from Dario. She heard the roar of an engine behind her, the sound growing closer, the headlights illuminating the road, blinding her, terrifying her. She knew. It was Bellini. He had come for her. She veered off the road, scrambling into the dense undergrowth, the branches tearing at her clothes, her skin, her hair. She stumbled, she fell, she crawled, she ran, her only thought to escape, to survive. She heard voices, shouting, calling her name, the sound closing in. She knew she couldn't outrun them. She couldn't hide forever. She was trapped. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, a figure she recognized, a figure she had both loved and feared.
Dario.
He grabbed her arm, his grip firm, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and something else. Relief, perhaps, or desperation. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice harsh, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Bellini, Alessandra stammered, her voice choked with fear. He tried to. Dario's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening, his grip tightening on her arm.
He what?
He wants me gone, Alessandra said, her voice barely a whisper. He wants to eliminate me. Dario's face contorted with rage, his eyes burning with a fury she had never seen before. He released her arm, his hands clenching into fists, his body trembling with barely contained violence. "I will kill him," he said, his voice a low growl, his words filled with a primal rage. The lion had roared. The serpent had struck. And Alessandra was caught in the middle, her fate hanging in the balance, her life about to change forever. But in which direction?
She didn't know.
But she knew that this night would mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, more dangerous one. Chapter 16. Flight and Pursuit. Dario's fury was a palpable force, a raw, untamed energy that radiated from him like heat from a furnace. He turned and stormed back towards the villa, his movements swift and purposeful, his intent clear, to confront Bellini, to punish him, to end the threat he posed to Alessandra, to himself, to their fragile, fractured world. Alessandra, however, knew that it was not that simple. Bellini was cunning, he was ruthless, he was prepared. He would not be easily defeated. He had planned this. He had anticipated Dario's reaction. He had set a trap, and Dario was walking straight into it. She had to stop him. She had to warn him. She had to save him. She ran after him, her lungs burning, her legs aching, her mind racing. She called his name, her voice hoarse, desperate, but he didn't hear her, or perhaps he didn't care. He was consumed by his rage, by his need for vengeance, by his love for her. She reached the villa just as he was entering, his figure silhouetted against the light streaming from the open doorway. She saw him confront Bellini, the two men facing each other, their bodies tense, their voices raised in anger, their words lost in the roar of the storm. She saw Bellini's men, surrounding Dario, their weapons drawn, their expressions menacing. She saw the trap closing, the net tightening, the inevitable outcome. She screamed, a desperate, primal cry that echoed through the night, a cry that was both a warning and a plea. Dario turned, his eyes meeting hers, his expression filled with a mixture of surprise and something else. Regret, perhaps, or a final farewell. Then, everything happened at once. Shots rang out, the sound deafening, the flashes of light illuminating the scene in a series of stark, horrifying images. Dario staggered, his body jerking, his hand going to his chest, his eyes widening in disbelief. Alessandra screamed again, her voice lost in the chaos, her legs giving way beneath her, her body collapsing to the ground, her world shattering into a million pieces. She crawled towards him, her hands outstretched, her mind numb with shock, with grief, with a despair she had never known before. She reached him, her fingers touching his blood-soaked shirt, his warm skin, his still body.
No.
She cried, her voice a raw, guttural sound that tore through the night.
No. Dario.
No. Bellini stepped forward, his smile cold, his eyes triumphant. He was a fool, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He let his feelings cloud his judgment. He turned to his men, his voice commanding,
Take her.
and dispose of her. Alessandra didn't resist.
She didn't care.
She had nothing left to live for. Her world had ended. Her love was gone. Her life was over. But as Bellini's men approached her, their hands reaching for her, their intentions clear, a new voice rang out, a voice filled with authority, with fury, with a power that silenced even Bellini. Enough. Isabella Benedetti stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes blazing, her expression a mixture of grief and rage. She held a gun in her hand, her aim steady, her target clear. Bellini. You traitor, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. You murderer. You dare to defile my home. With blood. Bellini's smile vanished, his expression replaced by a mixture of fear and disbelief. He tried to speak, to explain, to justify his actions, but Isabella cut him off. Silence. She commanded, her voice ringing with authority. You have betrayed us all. You have dishonored the family. You have killed my son. She fired the gun, the shot echoing through the night, the bullet finding its mark, Bellini's body collapsing to the ground, his life extinguished, his ambition thwarted, his betrayal avenged. Isabella turned to Alessandra, her gaze softening slightly, her expression filled with a mixture of grief, regret, and something else. Understanding, perhaps, or acceptance. He loved you, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He chose you. Over everything. She lowered the gun, her hand trembling, her body slumping with exhaustion, with grief, with the weight of her actions, of her choices, of her loss. The storm raged on, the rain washing away the blood, washing away the violence, washing away the past. But the scars remained, deep and indelible, etched into Alessandra's heart, etched into Isabella's soul, etched into the very fabric of the Benedetti family. Alessandra was taken, not as a prisoner, but as a mourner. She was given a room, not her gilded cage, but a simple chamber overlooking the gardens. She was allowed to grieve, to mourn, to remember. She knew she had to leave. She had to escape this world, this family, this legacy of violence and betrayal. But she also knew that she would never forget Dario. She would never forget his love. She would never forget the price he had paid, the sacrifice he had made. The flight had ended. The pursuit was over. But the journey, the healing, the reckoning, had just begun. And where it would lead, she could not know. But one thing was certain, she would never be the same. The events of this night had changed her, forever. Chapter 17. Sanctuary found, sanctuary lost. Alessandra left the Villa Benedetti under the cover of a new dawn, the sky still tinged with the remnants of the storm, the air washed clean by the rain. She left not as a captive, not as a fugitive, but as a woman transformed, a woman scarred by loss, strengthened by grief, and determined to forge her own path, to find her own peace, to escape the suffocating legacy of the famiglia. Isabella Benedetti had facilitated her departure, providing her with money, with documents, with a new identity, a new life, a chance to start again, to disappear, to become someone else, someone free from the shadows of the past. Go, Isabella had said, her voice hoarse, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resignation. And never look back. Alessandra had nodded, her throat tight with emotion, her heart aching with a grief that she knew would never fully heal. She had left without a word, without a goodbye, without a trace, slipping away into the anonymity of the city, leaving behind the gilded cage, the blood-stained villa, the memories of love and loss, of betrayal and sacrifice. She found refuge in a small, quiet village nestled in the hills of Tuscany, a place far removed from the opulence and violence of her former life, a place where she could blend in, disappear, become invisible, a place where she could heal, rebuild, start again. She rented a small cottage, its walls covered in ivy, its garden overgrown with wildflowers, its atmosphere peaceful, serene, a sanctuary from the turmoil of her past. She adopted a new name, a new identity, a new persona, becoming Signora Elena Rossi, a widow, a writer, a woman seeking solitude, seeking peace. She spent her days tending her garden, writing in her journal, exploring the village, interacting with the locals, slowly, tentatively, rebuilding her life, one day at a time, one step at a time, one breath at a time. She found solace in the simplicity of her new existence, in the beauty of the surrounding landscape, in the kindness of the villagers, in the quiet rhythm of her daily routine. She found a measure of peace, a sense of calm, a respite from the nightmares that still haunted her sleep, from the memories that still flooded her mind, from the grief that still weighed heavily on her heart. But the sanctuary was not to last. The past, like a persistent shadow, refused to stay buried, refused to release its grip, refused to let her go. One afternoon, as she was returning from the village market, her basket filled with fresh produce, her mind occupied with mundane thoughts, she saw a familiar figure standing in front of her cottage, a figure that sent a shiver of fear down her spine, a figure that shattered the fragile peace she had so carefully constructed. Don Carlo Rossi, the rival capo, the man who had once assessed her with the cold, calculating gaze of a buyer examining a piece of livestock, the man who had represented everything she hated, everything she feared, everything she had tried to escape. He smiled, his expression smug, his eyes holding a glint of triumph. "Signora Romano," he said, his voice smooth as silk, his tone mocking. "Or should I say Signora Rossi? It is so good to see you again." Alessandra's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing, her instincts screaming at her to flee, to hide, to escape. But she knew it was futile. He had found her. The past had caught up with her. The sanctuary was lost. What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling, her body shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. He stepped closer, his presence intrusive, his scent of expensive cologne a stark reminder of the world she had left behind. "I want what is rightfully mine," he said, his voice low, his gaze intense. I don't understand," she stammered, her mind struggling to comprehend his words. He chuckled, a soft, chilling sound. "Dario owed me a debt," he said, his voice a whisper. "A debt that was never paid.
A debt that you will now repay."
Alessandra felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She understood. She was the debt. She was the prize. She was the spoils of war. "I owe you nothing," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her heart. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the quiet village. "You are mistaken, Signora," he said, his voice cold, his eyes hardening. "You are mine now." He reached for her, his hand closing around her arm, his grip firm, painful. She struggled, she fought, she resisted, but he was too strong. He dragged her towards a waiting car, his men surrounding them, their expressions menacing, their intentions clear. Alessandra knew that she was trapped. She had escaped one cage only to find herself in another, perhaps even more dangerous, more terrifying than the one she had left behind. The sanctuary was lost. The past had returned. And the future, once again, was uncertain, filled with fear, with danger, with the suffocating weight of the family, of their rules, of their vengeance. The carefully constructed peace was shattered. She was no longer Elena Rossi, the quiet widow. She was Alessandra Romano, the capo's plaything, once again. Or was she something more now? Chapter 18. The Reckoning of Old Wounds. Alessandra was taken to another villa, this one even more opulent, more ostentatious than Dario's, a display of wealth and power that felt cold, sterile, devoid of any warmth, any humanity. It was a prison, albeit a luxurious one, a gilded cage designed to hold her captive, to break her spirit, to force her submission. Don Carlo Rossi treated her with a chilling courtesy, a deliberate politeness that was more menacing than any outright threat. He provided her with every comfort, every luxury, every material possession she could possibly desire, but he also made it clear that she was his prisoner, his possession, his property. "You will learn to appreciate your new life, Signora," he said, his voice smooth as silk, his eyes holding a glint of something. Amusement, perhaps, or a subtle challenge. "You will learn to obey." Alessandra, however, refused to be broken. She refused to be intimidated. She refused to surrender. She had survived the Benedetti family, she had survived loss, she had survived betrayal, and she would survive this, too. She maintained a facade of composure, of quiet defiance, her eyes meeting his without flinching, her voice steady, her spirit unbroken. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear, of seeing her weakness, of seeing her break. She spent her days exploring the villa, observing, learning, planning, searching for a way out, a way to escape, a way to reclaim her freedom. She studied the routines of the household, the movements of the guards, the layout of the grounds, the weaknesses of the security, the possibilities for resistance. She also tried to understand Don Carlo Rossi, to decipher his motivations, to identify his vulnerabilities, to find a way to exploit them, to use them against him. She engaged him in conversation, asking him questions, probing his past, his ambitions, his desires. She learned that he was driven by a deep-seated resentment, a burning desire for revenge, a need to prove himself, to surpass Dario, to claim what he believed was rightfully his. He saw Alessandra as a symbol of his victory, a trophy, a prize to be displayed, a means of humiliating the Benedetti family, of asserting his dominance. But she also sensed a vulnerability in him, a loneliness, a deep-seated insecurity that he tried to mask with arrogance and power. He was a man haunted by his past, by his failures, by his inadequacies. One evening, as they were having dinner, Alessandra decided to challenge him, to confront him, to test the limits of his control. "Why do you hate Dario so much?" she asked, her voice calm, her gaze steady. He looked at her, his expression surprised, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Hate?" he repeated, his voice laced with amusement. "I do not hate him, Signora. I pity him. He was weak. He let his emotions rule him." "And you?" she asked, her voice challenging. "Do you not have emotions? Do you not have feelings?" He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the room. "Emotions are a weakness, Signora. A liability. I have learned to control them,
To use them.
to my advantage." "And what about love?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you not believe in love?" He looked at her, his gaze intense, his expression unreadable. "Love," he said, his voice a low murmur, "is a fantasy.
A fairy tale.
For fools. And women." "You are wrong," she said, her voice firm. "Love is strength. Love is power. Love is the only thing that matters." He stood up, his movements abrupt, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked towards her, his presence overwhelming, his eyes burning into hers. "You are naive, Signora," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You still cling to your illusions. You still believe in fairy tales." He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, the touch sending a shiver of revulsion down her spine. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She met his gaze, her expression defiant. "I believe in myself," she said, her voice steady. "I believe in my strength. I believe in my ability to survive." He chuckled, a soft, chilling sound. "We shall see, Signora," he said, his voice a whisper.
We shall see.
He turned and walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts, with her fears, with her determination. The reckoning of old wounds had begun. Alessandra knew that she was playing a dangerous game, that she was walking a tightrope, That one wrong move could lead to her destruction. But she also knew that she had no other choice. She had to fight. For her freedom. For her sanity. For the memory of Dario. And she would not give up. She would not surrender. She would prevail. Even if it was the last thing she did. She had faced the lion and the serpent. Now, she faced the wolf. And she would not cower. Chapter 19. Unmasking the past, embracing the future. Alessandra's defiance, her quiet strength, her refusal to be broken, began to unsettle Don Carlo Rossi. He had expected her to crumble, to plead, to beg for his mercy, to become a docile, obedient possession. But she remained defiant, her spirit unbroken, her gaze unwavering, her will unyielding. He increased the pressure, tightening his control, restricting her movements, isolating her further, trying to break her, to force her submission. But she resisted, her resolve strengthening with each passing day, her determination fueled by her memories, by her anger, by her hope. She continued to observe, to learn, to plan, searching for a weakness, a vulnerability, an opportunity to escape, to reclaim her freedom. She discovered that Rossi was obsessed with his image, with his reputation, with the perception of his power. He was meticulous, controlling, and deeply insecure, hiding his vulnerabilities behind a facade of arrogance and strength. She also discovered that he was haunted by a secret from his past, a betrayal, a loss, a wound that had never healed, a wound that fueled his ambition, his ruthlessness, his hatred for Dario. One evening, during one of their strained dinners, Alessandra decided to exploit this weakness, to use his past against him, to unmask him, to force him to confront his demons. "I know about your brother," she said, her voice calm, her gaze steady, her words carefully chosen. Rossi froze, his expression shifting from amusement to shock, his eyes widening slightly, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. What are you talking about?" He stammered, his voice losing its usual smoothness, his composure cracking. "Your brother," Alessandra repeated, her voice unwavering. "The one you betrayed.
The one you allowed to die.
The one who loved the same woman Dario did." Rossi's face contorted with rage, his hands clenching into fists, his body trembling with barely contained fury. You know nothing," he growled, his voice a low, guttural sound. "I know everything," Alessandra countered, her voice firm. "I know about your jealousy, your ambition, your treachery. I know that you orchestrated your brother's death. To eliminate a rival. To claim what you believed was rightfully yours." Rossi stood up, his chair crashing to the floor, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and fear. "You lie," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "I do not lie," Alessandra said, her voice steady. "I speak the truth. A truth you have hidden. From everyone. Even yourself." She stood up, facing him, her gaze unwavering, her expression filled with a strange mixture of pity and contempt. "You are a coward, Don Carlo," she said, her voice soft, but filled with power. "You are a weakling. You are a man consumed by his own demons." Rossi lunged at her, his hands reaching for her throat, his intention clear. To silence her, to punish her, to destroy her. But Alessandra was prepared. She had anticipated his reaction. She had planned for this moment. She had honed her skills. She had steeled her nerves. She sidestepped his attack, her movements swift and graceful, her reflexes honed by weeks of training, of preparation, of waiting. She grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back, forcing him to his knees, her grip firm, her strength surprising. "I am not afraid of you, Don Carlo," she said, her voice cold, her eyes blazing. "I am not afraid of your threats. I am not afraid of your power. I am Alessandra Romano. And I will not be broken." She released him, pushing him away, her expression filled with disgust. He stumbled back, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and fear. He had underestimated her. He had misjudged her. He had lost. The guards, who had been watching the scene unfold, their expressions uncertain, their loyalties divided, hesitated, unsure of what to do. They had been trained to obey Rossi, but they had also witnessed his weakness, his vulnerability, his defeat. Alessandra seized the opportunity. She turned to the guards, her voice ringing with authority, her gaze commanding their attention. "He is a traitor," she said, her voice clear, her words carefully chosen. "He betrayed his family. He betrayed his brother. He betrayed you." She pointed to Rossi, who was still kneeling on the floor, his head bowed, his body shaking, his spirit broken. "He is not worthy of your loyalty, of your service, of your respect." The guards hesitated for a moment, then, one by one, they lowered their weapons, their expressions shifting from uncertainty to understanding. They had seen the truth. They had witnessed the unmasking. They had chosen a new leader. Alessandra took a deep breath, her heart pounding, her body trembling, but her spirit soaring. She had done it. She had unmasked the past. She had confronted the demons. She had won. She turned and walked away, leaving Rossi to his fate, leaving the villa to its secrets, leaving the famiglia to their reckoning. She walked out into the night, the air cool and fresh, the stars shining brightly above, the future uncertain, but filled with hope. She was free. She was Alessandra. And she would embrace the future, whatever it held, with courage, with strength, with love. She was no longer the capo's plaything or anyone's possession. She was her own woman, finally. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. Alessandra's newfound freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. She had escaped the clutches of Don Carlo Rossi. She had unmasked his treachery. She had reclaimed her agency, but she was still alone, still vulnerable, still haunted by the past, still uncertain of the future. She knew she couldn't return to her old life, to her family, to her friends, to her former identity. She was still a target, still a threat, still a pawn in the deadly game played by the famiglia. She had to disappear, to vanish, to create a new life, a new identity, a new sanctuary. But before she could do that, she had one final confrontation to face, one final reckoning to make, one final loose end to tie. She had to confront Isabella Benedetti, to tell her the truth about Dario's death, to expose Bellini's treachery, to clear his name. She knew it was dangerous. She knew it was risky. She knew it could cost her her life. But she also knew that she couldn't live with herself. She couldn't move on. She couldn't find peace until she had done it. She owed it to Dario, to his memory, to his love. She returned to the Benedetti ancestral home, not as a captive, not as a fugitive, but as a woman on a mission, a woman driven by grief, by anger, by a fierce determination to seek justice, to find closure, to honor the man she had loved. She arrived under the cover of darkness, the villa shrouded in shadows, the air thick with unspoken tensions, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of generations of secrets, of betrayals, of loss. She found Isabella in the same drawing room where she had first met her, the room where she had been judged, condemned, rejected. Isabella was sitting by the fireplace, her face pale, her eyes shadowed, her expression a mixture of grief, regret, and something else. Resignation, perhaps, or a weary acceptance of her fate. "You," Isabella said, her voice hoarse, her gaze fixed on Alessandra, her tone devoid of the hostility, the disdain that had characterized their previous encounters. "I came to tell you the truth," Alessandra said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "About Dario. About his death." Isabella looked at her, her expression unreadable, her silence a silent invitation to speak. Alessandra told her everything, sparing no detail, hiding nothing, revealing the full extent of Bellini's treachery, of Rossi's cruelty, of Dario's sacrifice, of her own love for him. She spoke of Bellini's ambition, of his manipulation, of his plot to eliminate Dario, to seize control of the family, to claim Alessandra as his prize. She spoke of Rossi's vengeance, of his cruelty, of his attempt to break her, to force her submission, to destroy her. She spoke of Dario's love for her, of his courage, of his willingness to sacrifice everything, to protect her, to save her. She spoke of his final moments, of his death, of her grief. Isabella listened in silence, her face pale, her body trembling, her eyes filled with a mixture of horror, disbelief, and pain. She didn't interrupt. She didn't question. She didn't judge. She simply listened. When Alessandra had finished, a long silence filled the room, the only sound the crackling of the fire, the only movement the flickering of the flames. I did not know, Isabella finally said, her voice barely a whisper, her words choked with emotion. I misjudged him. I misjudged you. She looked at Alessandra, her eyes filled with a profound sadness, a deep regret, a belated understanding. He loved you, she said, her voice trembling. He truly loved you. Alessandra nodded, her throat tight with emotion, her eyes filling with tears. And I loved him. Isabella stood up, her movements slow, deliberate, her body frail, her spirit broken. She walked towards Alessandra, her hand outstretched, her touch surprisingly gentle. I am sorry, she said, her voice a raw, guttural sound that tore through the silence. For everything. For my mistakes. For my blindness. For my cruelty. Alessandra took her hand, her grip firm, her heart aching with a mixture of grief, forgiveness, and a strange sense of peace. It is over, Alessandra said, her voice soft, but filled with a newfound strength. The past is buried. The future is unwritten. Isabella nodded, her eyes meeting Alessandra's, a silent understanding passing between them, a bond forged in grief, in loss, in acceptance. Go, Isabella said, her voice firm, but gentle. And live. Live for him. Live for yourself. Live free. Alessandra released her hand, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. She turned and walked away, leaving Isabella to her grief, leaving the villa to its secrets, leaving the family to their fate. She walked out into the night, the air cool and fresh, the stars shining brightly above, the future uncertain, but filled with possibilities. She was free. She was Alessandra. And she would embrace the future, whatever it held, with courage, with strength, with love. The final confrontation had been made. Hearts had been laid bare, loyalties tested, and now a new chapter could begin. One of her own making. The plaything was gone. The woman remained. Epilogue. The Tuscan sun warmed Alessandra's face as she sat on the terrace of her small cottage, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the olive trees that surrounded her, the scent of lavender and rosemary filling the air. It had been 5 years since she had left the Villa Benedetti, 5 years since she had escaped the clutches of the famigli, 5 years since she had shed her old identity and embraced a new life, a new beginning. She was no longer Alessandra Romano, the capo's plaything, the pawn in a deadly game of power and betrayal. She was Elena Rossi, a writer, an artist, a woman of independent means, a woman who had found peace, solace, and a quiet contentment in the simplicity of her new existence. She had published a book, a novel loosely based on her experiences, a story of love and loss, of betrayal and redemption, of a woman's journey from captivity to freedom. It had been a critical and commercial success, earning her recognition, respect, and a measure of financial security. She had also found love again, a gentle, nurturing love, a love that was a world away from the passionate, dangerous, all-consuming love she had shared with Dario. She had met Marco, a local artist, a kind, sensitive man who had helped her to heal, to trust, to open her heart again. They were not married. They had no plans to marry, but they shared a deep connection, a mutual respect, a quiet companionship that filled her days with warmth, with laughter, with love. She still thought of Dario, of course. His memory was a constant presence in her life, a bittersweet reminder of the past, of the love she had lost, of the price he had paid. She kept a small, silver locket hidden away, a locket containing a miniature portrait of him, a memento of their time together, a symbol of a love that would never truly die. But she no longer grieved for him. She had accepted his death. She had made peace with her past. She had found a way to move on, to embrace the future, to live a life that honored his memory, that celebrated his sacrifice, that justified her survival. She looked out at the rolling hills of Tuscany, the vineyards stretching as far as the eye could see, the sun setting in a blaze of glory, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple. She felt a sense of gratitude, of peace, of contentment. She had found her sanctuary. She had reclaimed her freedom. She had found herself. A hand touched her shoulder, a gentle, familiar touch that sent a wave of warmth through her body. She turned and smiled, her eyes meeting Marco's, his gaze filled with love, with affection, with understanding. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice soft, his Italian accented with the gentle lilt of the Tuscan countryside. "Yes," she replied, her voice filled with emotion. "It is." He sat down beside her, his arm going around her waist, drawing her close, offering her comfort, offering her support, offering her love. They sat in silence, watching the sunset, their bodies touching, their hearts connected, their souls at peace. The past was behind them, the future was uncertain, but in this moment, in this place, in this love, they had found their everything. The gilded cage was a distant memory. The scars remained, but they were no longer wounds. They were reminders of her strength, her resilience, her triumph. And as the darkness gathered and the stars began to shine, Alessandra knew that she was finally, truly free. She had lived many lives in a short time, and now, finally, she was living her own. And it was beautiful.